Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Nona Stabel and I will be your moderator today. On behalf of Everbridge, I would like to welcome you to this webinar, Predictable IT Incident Responses in Unpredictable Times. Our format will be a presentation followed by a question and answer session. Before we start the webinar, I'm going to cover some housekeeping. You are all in listen-only mode. At the right side of your screen, you see a box for questions. You can submit one at any time. Links to the recording for today will be available within a few days and will be sent out to you by email. So now, I would like to introduce you to our speakers for today. Prashant Darisi from Everbridge and Jayan Perera from Control Rest. So now I would like to turn it over to you, Jayan, to start your presentation. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Nona. And thank you everyone for joining. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you all today and to discuss what is quite a lively and I think topical subject from my perspective. By brief way of introduction, I look after Control Risk cyber response capability and have some experience in supporting clients across the world dealing with cyber response issues, which often deal with significant disruption and IT downtime. And so I think this particular topic is one close to my heart, but also something that I think is very topical with boards and IT leaders at the moment as well. So my aim today in my section before I hand over to Prashant is to give you a sense of the types of trends and issues that we're seeing in the cyber world, and then hopefully sort of translating that slightly into how that then can impact how we run incident response teams and technologies in order to be optimized in the way that we deal with cyber incidents and threats. So to kick off with, I really just wanted to give a reflection, I think, of 2020 and talk about what we saw last year, and then also talk about what we're expecting to see this year at a kind of thematic level before we get into some of the nitty-gritty of the specific trends that we're seeing out there in the wild. And as Nona mentioned, if you've got any questions, please put them into the chat and we can pick them up later on, but I'll crack on for now. So to begin with, obviously 2020, interesting year for many reasons. I think the operative word was unprecedented, and I think that goes the same for cyber issues as well. Obviously, lockdown and the pandemic has shifted so much in the way that we work and operate, and threats have really looked to capitalize on that. And in the immediate after effects of some of the actions taking almost a year to the day today, at least in Europe, were targeted by attackers who were looking to mimic state campaigns for things like small business loans or tax breaks for small businesses again. So I think the key thing to say there is that the pandemic was something that was exploited, but secondly, it also shows that I think there's a high degree of ingenuity and responsiveness we're seeing from threat actors, whether that's criminals or nation states, who are looking to really capitalize on how changes in the environment can be leveraged in order to have more convincing attack strategies and things like phishing campaigns as well. What's also interesting on the second point there around that theme of capitalization is this topic of how individual groups have been targeting industries that are ripe for the picking in their opinions. And the good example I'll give here is healthcare. We saw towards the end of spring, start of summer in Europe, for instance, last year, a real increase in the number of medical and healthcare organizations that were targeted with disruptive types of cyber attacks, things like ransomware attacks. And I think in one case at least actually led to the death of an individual, which is really a new territory for cyber. I think we've always talked about sort of computers attacking computers, but in this case there was a resultant death, which was quite interesting, but also obviously quite tragic in many ways. So that shows again that really attackers are starting to understand that particular industries can have a lot of leverage pushed up against them to try and push them towards large payments. And we've seen fairly large payments go out to those kind of organizations. We're talking in the millions of dollars, not just sort of small amounts that you'd associate with the SMEs as well. And that's likely to continue into the next year as well. But I think 2020 as a whole was a year where we saw these attackers really capitalizing on people and organizations who are at risk and seeing how that can work. On the flip side, as just an interesting aside, we did also have some groups who came out and said, we will not let anybody use our ransomware variants in order to target medical centres because of the importance that they're playing in society today. And hence, as a result, there was a real sort of focus from them to say if they caught anybody using it, there would be some kind of punitive measures for that group, and also they would provide the decryption keys for any ransomware, again as an example, for free. So a really interesting change in the way that these types of groups are communicating openly on the market as well. I think continuing this sort of thread of pandemic, one of the other things that was obviously a huge change for everybody last year was working from home. And I don't need to talk about how that's changed and how people are operating, but I think from an organizational standpoint, one thing that work from home has really done is increase the surface area, or the attack surface, of organizations to an uncomfortable level in a lot of cases where individuals are now working from home. They've taken their corporate IT equipment home as well. They're often doing both personal and work-related activities on these devices because it's their primary device at home. And as a result, I think there's quite a lot of risk that's being opened up there. And I'll give you an example of one of our clients where they're, again, at the beginning of the pandemic, their developing arm went completely remote. Their developers, without really thinking about it, took IT assets that were developing quite important applications for their next year strategy for 2021, one of which was already loaded with live client data. They took that particular device home behind, being honest, not very good security controls and not behind their typical development environment. And that led to a vulnerability being leveraged and an attacker being able to steal the information on those servers. So again, this work from home issue doesn't just present more social engineering opportunity, but also opens up additional vulnerabilities that businesses need to be aware of and consider when it comes to both monitoring but also defending against attacks. And finally, just to sort of round off on 2020, in December, we had a huge attack that came out into the public affairs, which was around SolarWinds, who are a large software developer and who produced a lot of software for a number of different government institutions. They were targeted as essentially a supply chain hacker. We'll come back to this idea of supply chains being vulnerable, but it was a really, I think, quite a watershed moment for a lot of organizations that typically see large software houses as safe hands when it comes to security development. The attackers were able to get access to a platform that allowed them to see how development was being done in SolarWinds, and then embed within the latest update a series of malicious pieces of code that allowed them to have backdoor access into any of the organizations that ran that particular update, including a number of US government sites as well. So it was sort of a real sort of boom into the year where people were sort of caught unaware. But interestingly enough, this trend of, I think, supply chain attacks is something that's sort of continued going forward. I think sort of looking ahead to 2020, sorry, going back one. Sorry, skipped ahead on two slides there. But in terms of looking ahead to 2021, we're going to continue seeing innovation from both companies to try and stay ahead in terms of commercial awareness and making sure that they're connecting with their customers in different ways. We saw an unprecedented uptick in the number of ways, or the number of interactions that companies were having online with their customers, and we're going to see that continue into 2021. But on top of that, of course, that brings with it risk, and attackers trying to use these new technologies to try and adopt new attack techniques and targeting patterns in order to have the largest amount of damage possible, at least a large amount of returns as well. So that won't go anywhere. We're seeing that particularly with the advent of smart cities and adjustments in that regard, but also automation in things like the automotive industry as well. So I think watch this space. That's something we're going to see as we go forward. We'll also see data nationalism causing some existential crises in terms of how people are sharing and dealing with data. And we'll come to that a little bit later in terms of how regulation is shaping that. But it's an interesting point because I think with the US and China in particular, and of course we've seen how the Huawei scandal, but also TikTok more recently, has caused rifts in the way that governments are looking to use and store data, and indeed allow private institutions to look at data. This is something that's going to continue to be a concern and actually muddy the waters, particularly for organizations that that do respond. And actually, I've worked with a number of clients who, when they are responding to incidents, often find themselves foul of local data regulation because they aren't necessarily on top of what's going on at a government level, but also a regulator level. So again, we'll come to that later on, but it's an interesting thing that we'll continue to see perhaps fracture later on in the year as well. We're also seeing point 3 there, sort of professionalization of groups. We reference this as the cyber cartel, this idea that groups are becoming less fragmented, but actually a little bit more connected. And again, a good example of this is in ransomware attacks, where we're starting to see the proliferation of ransomware as a service, where one group will develop the ransomware technology, so the actual software that is used or the malware that is used to encrypt data, but at the same time they'll use a network of affiliates who are almost like franchisees who have access to the latest and greatest version of that code, who will then provide access or indeed deliver the code to a number of organizations and split the winnings, as it were, the revenue they generate from that with the core group. So it's becoming, I think, a more complex network of interactions between groups who are not just buying access, but providing it, selling access to groups, and then also those who are right at the center of it, creating things like ransomware and providing that on. So that's going to continue this year. And I think finally, exploitation, and this goes back to the innovation point as well. Targeting behaviors will start to mimic technology trends. And this is something that's really interesting, where technology suppliers like SolarWinds are going to be targeted more and more for their general everyday kind of activity, to see if they can mimic and mask malicious activity behind that. And what will be really interesting to see how attackers try to mimic the SolarWinds success, which is largely attributed to nation state level attacks. But we're probably going to see similar type of activities from criminals in the next year as well. So a really interesting, I think, look forward. And what that means obviously for incident response teams is that we're going to have to be on our toes more so than ever before. And it's not all doom and gloom. Of course, there are lots of technologies that are coming out there, and Prashant will come onto how we can sort of work together to try and build a better responsive organization through technology. But I think it's interesting to just see how the differences between 2020 and 2021 will start to emerge later on this year as well. Looking into the specific incidents and getting into the nitty gritty a little bit more, from control risk perspectives, we're working on cyber cases across the globe, notably with our heritage in dealing with extortion issues, whether that's kidnapping, ransoms, product extortions, and more recently, of course, digital extortions of sorts, including cyber attacks like ransomware. We're starting to see a number of incidents emerge as trends, at least recently in the last sort of 2 to 3 months. The first is ransomware, which I've referenced heavily already, involving data extortion. Those of you who are familiar with ransomware will know that, at its core, ransomware hasn't changed dramatically over the last few years. You're still getting an encryption event that encrypts a large swathe of data. You still receive a demand that says if you do not pay a ransom, you will not recover that data. But what's more recent in the last sort of 6 to 9 months is the advent of a data extortion that's bolted onto that. So not only are we seeing attacks where organizations are being targeted, data is being encrypted, but we're also then seeing data exfiltration of sensitive data, which is then used as additional leverage in a negotiation to try and elicit some kind of payment. And we've seen that unfortunately be quite successful. And we've gone from a place where people, generally speaking, were trying to avoid paying ransoms at all costs, feeling like perhaps they need to consider that now more regularly as a result of the data extortion piece. So that's something we're seeing quite heavily. We're also seeing Microsoft Exchange issues that any of you who are sort of on the front end of incident response within organizations will be absolutely no stranger to this. There was a recent set of vulnerabilities that came out which looked to target or had 0 days on Microsoft Exchange servers, where individuals and organizations were running them on premises at home, so in the organization. And as a result of that, Microsoft released a number of patches and have tried to sort of patch the issues there. I think the latest count by some organizations is about 30% of servers globally are still vulnerable to this. So we're still seeing a number of these vulnerabilities emerge. And interestingly, going back to my point about organizations in the criminal world being a little bit more on their toes, we're starting to see bespoke ransomware being tailored to these particular vulnerabilities to try and capitalize on these vulnerabilities existing in the wild as well. So that's going to continue, I think, for the next few months to be something that's a hot topic and something that will quite frankly keep us busy. Thirdly, tailored social engineering relating to fraud, things like business email compromise, president fraud, these tried and tested methods of fraud that are digital in means, they are not going anywhere anytime soon. And in fact, they're being more tailored now, I think, to the pandemic. I mentioned some of this sort of government scheme and government level loans that are going out to, in particular, SMEs in various organizations and governments across the world. That is continuing, and we haven't seen a sort of a tip off on that. Indeed, we saw a spike at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. We'll continue to see this as government regulation, but also messaging on things dealing with small to medium sized businesses in particular, but also larger enterprises continues to be a bit of a fluid area as well. And finally, a really large part that we'll come back to is this kind of idea of third-party supply chain attacks. This is really going to be a hot topic for this year. We've started to see it already, where people who are running their IT through infrastructure that is not necessarily run by themselves, so it's a third party of some sort, they are starting to see that they're involved in attacks that have impacted third parties and have purposefully targeted IT providers, for instance, who have access to multiple different infrastructure as well. So it's a really interesting, I think, addition to the type of ecosystem we're seeing. We started to see that a while ago, if you remember the Target hack a number of years ago now, but really it's coming to its own, and we're starting to see particularly IT related organizations being targeted, not because they themselves have sensitive information or a business critical application they need to run, but also because they are conduits to target a number of other organizations as well as they go through. So that's a little bit about what we're seeing at the moment. This is a very busy slide, so I won't dwell on it for too long. We'll just sort of trot through it. But the key thing here is we're also seeing this increasingly fragmented regulatory landscape, which sits at the back of everybody's mind when we talk about specific attacks. Of course, at a technical level, attacks are happening every single day. They are varying. The vulnerabilities that are being used are changing. The tools that are used are changing, and we're matching those. But one of the things that's making responding very difficult, and I think it does even impact the way that technical responders like us on this call will be responding, is just how fragmented the regulatory landscape would be. So if you're happen to be a global enterprise operating in multiple different jurisdictions, there's no doubt now more than ever when an attack occurs or something significant occurs where there potentially is a data exfiltration event, there needs to be a real hard look from a legal perspective as to what specific regulatory requirements you have to notify either regulators or individuals in relation to that attack. And actually, in some cases, I've seen that the costs relating to this element of notification far outstrip the cost of actually the technical response and getting people back to where they need to be as well. So that's, I think, an interesting topic. And again, I won't dwell on it for too long, but you can just see from Russia to China to the US, and of course GDPR in Europe, but NIS in Europe as well, which is sort of deepening those requirements for protecting sensitive data. These are all creating sometimes complementary, but sometimes competing principles of data protection that is going to cause some trouble for organizations going forward as well. So it's something that I always try and push quite hard at the beginning of an incident is what are our legal and regulatory obligations, and how are we tracking that, and how can we as IT teams identify where we think there may be a risk so that we can more appropriately and quickly at a crisis management level make the right decisions to then fold back down into our technical decision making and forensics efforts as well. So I just wanted to quickly talk through a case study, but I think we can canter through it very, very quickly. We were working very recently with a European telecommunications firm who experienced a ransomware attack, which impacted essentially all of their endpoints, including databases. And they received significant demand, which was, I think, north of $2 million for decryption and the deletion of data that supposedly the attackers had stolen. Now, the direct impact of this was that there are a number of clients who used a critical web application that was client facing that essentially didn't have that anymore, and they were using that application to run new business. So they were using data from that to essentially provide new packages of data and calls to their own customers. So there was quite a direct and significant impact on our clients essentially. We had to, on this case, deploy crisis managers, cyber forensics, extortion experts, and work alongside external counsel, as well as others, including sort of communications experts, to drive this forward. And we sat as the crisis management expert on these cases. We ran quite a large-scale cyber investigation, looking at a number of those endpoints to try and establish where they were in terms of containment and eradication. That was successful. We also, interestingly, engaged in potentially in sort of understanding what the negotiations might be, and then we also supported them in regulatory notification. What was interesting about this was not the fact that we were such a broad response that was required given what was there, but actually what was really interesting is when we identified the root cause and started to provide a fix, we opted for a buy time route where we weren't looking to engage with the attackers directly. We just simply wanted to buy time by engaging with them to see whether or not they would be interested in providing us the decryption keys and ensuring that we had time to recover. What was really interesting, though, was that before we decided to actually communicate with them, we said, look, let's hold out as long as we can. And the entity decided in the end that they did not want to engage with the attackers at all. We ended up sort of just sitting back and watching as the attackers did not get in contact despite us going through the deadlines. And this is a really interesting example where instead of them being, as they typically are, true to their word and saying you have 3 days to come back to us, otherwise we leak information, they actually didn't get back to us at all. And through the analysis that we did, we found that actually that cartel model that I was talking about earlier meant that you had different attackers targeting the network. And we identified 3 different groups who essentially were conflicting. And we believe what happened was that they had their own internal conflict between them. That meant that nobody took ownership for the attack, even though it was relatively successful. They didn't actually understand how successful it was. And so they actually moved on from that attack and they weren't going to cause any further harm or disclose any information. That was a really interesting case where actually we hadn't really seen that behavior before. We've seen it a few times since, but again, this is an example of how complex and nuanced these cases can be. And finally, just in terms of recommendations, before I hand over to Prashant, looking forward to those of you on the call who may be regularly involved in incident response type activity, I think there are 4 core things that I think incident responders need to think about right now, not just at the technology level, but actually more broadly in terms of how organizations respond. And the first is to, and it sounds very, very obvious, but it's surprising how many enterprises I work with where this isn't really something that's done. And this is develop and exercise strategic cyber response plans. And the key thing here is not just to do this in a silo with your crisis management team in a room. They do it on an annual basis. They tick the box that they've done it, but actually to do this as more of a cross-enterprise scheme where we have maybe those who are responsible for IT response, as well as those who are responsible for the sort of corporate response, working in tandem, perhaps in different rooms, perhaps remotely, to just, I think, exercise how these different groups will share data. And critically, that has to incorporate business continuity management as well as ITDR as well. And so where that can be done, it's really, really powerful, because often when we work on these ransomware cases, or indeed other types of cases where there's an outage, the time to recover is very much dependent not just upon how good the cyber forensics are, but actually how good the recovery plans are, full stop, and how well we know our assets, how well we know our providers and suppliers, and hence how quickly we know we can get back up and running. Because at its core, we're really dealing with the business continuity exercise, we're dealing with the recovery exercise, regardless of whether that was started by a cyber incident or whether it's sort of something else. Secondly, and Prashant can talk to this a little bit more, I think it's really important to invest in monitoring and detection capability. Early identification is really, really critical here. And where we work with organizations that proactively engage us on the front end before there's a major incident, quite often we're able to identify how an attacker got in, close that access, and prevent a larger attack from happening. It sounds great, but it's actually quite a difficult thing to do. But I think if there's one area of sort of security that's worth looking at investing in the next year, I think monitoring and detection is one of those key areas. Third, I think one thing that really saves time before organizations like us turn up on site is having technology teams understand how forensics will work. So internal IT teams understanding how to preserve data, how to preserve systems before taking them offline, or indeed keeping them online, but maybe just segregated in some way to aid the analysis that's likely to come down the line. often we ask the same questions again and again. So where you have a retained relationship with a third-party provider to provide forensics and IR, for instance, I'd recommend giving them a call and saying, hey, can we have a quick call and understand how you would like to receive this data, so that we're not waiting around whilst we wait for you to spin up. Instead, we can kind of collect all the data you'll need, have that ready to go, and then provide that to you as and when that's required. And if you have an internal forensics team, the same sort of conversation could happen. But it's surprising again to me how often organizations aren't ready to deal with that. And then finally, in terms of planning and rehearsing, I think there's this element of ensuring that senior teams are rehearsing what they'll do around ransomware demands and negotiations, staying on top of that and providing sort of insight into that as well. But those are my sort of 4 key recommendations. I think I've gone over slightly on time, but again, happy to have any questions relating to that later on. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Prashant.
Excellent, Jay. Thank you. Thank you for setting the table up. So with all the news that we've heard, why is it so hard? I think if you can understand the moving parts of it, it probably will help us prepare better. And I think it's simple, right? If you look at it, we get so many triggers every day. You probably have 24 monitoring tools that are out there: malware systems, endpoint systems, web traffic, log miners, right? A bunch of tools. The issue is what Jay was talking about, is you have to be able to react quickly and react early. And in cybersecurity world, we always talk about the concept of a dwell time. The longer the attacker dwells on your system, the worse the damage. And so when there is so much of noise in the system, how quickly can you understand, assess, and figure out the context and severity is why this is so hard. And the second thing is its impact, right? As you know, generally almost every ticket gets opened as a SEV1 or a P1. Everybody's ticket, everybody's incident, every event that comes through gets opened up as a P1. So as Jay was talking about, is this something that's affecting multiple customers? What's the real spread of it? What's the business impact? What's the cost of impact? And what are the legal ramifications or legal obligations that we have to fulfill? It's very, very hard to understand, even if you have removed the signal from the noise, to understand the immediate business impact, so that when you see 2 tickets of a similar nature, you're actually able to figure out where should you prioritize your best subject matter experts. And that's typically what we see is the challenge. And then, we are now talking about working from home, right? We're talking about working from home where digital assets, intellectual property sometimes is crossing the boundary of a security framework, because people are saying it's okay, there is no other way for us to be productive, right? This whole concept of collaboration hubs, digital war rooms, instantly starting smart conferencing, not only just starting, or communication on MS Teams, Slack, but perhaps obligations that we have to actually archive every piece of conversation. Maybe we need to keep the audio recording out there. It's very, very important. And then finally, as Jay was talking about, how do you make sure that next time something like this happens, you're actually performing better? That concept of forensics, that concept of blameless root cause analysis, that concept of preparing the right auditable and compliance driven reports, so that if there is a breach, what are your obligations as per the local regulations? Do you have to declare it? How quickly do you have to declare it? When should a stakeholder be informed of it? When should the resolution team? It's given this 4-step process. We look at these challenges where I think we need to start putting our energies to solving the problem. And like we said, the dwell time is very, very important here. So from our perspective, when I look at this entire concept, I think we can break this down into a process that we call as the drift process. And like Jay was talking about, invest early and enough in understanding what kind of triggers you're getting. Are they all going to a central location? Is there seamless orchestration going on? Do you understand when 3 systems come and give you an alert, what it really means? Do you have a clear understanding of your services mapping, so that you understand, oh, this is a banking service, or this is the retail, this is a point of sale, or credit card, clearance and transaction, any of those things? we certainly need to understand the first part, the detection, and then you have to move into rally and respond, right? Who is the right subject matter expert based on the type of incidents? If it happens to be a firewall issue, do you really need a firewall expert? Do you also need a backend expert? Do you need a networking person? If a particular system is experiencing attack, what kind of a cross-functional team do we have? And remember, all these teams have different HR structures. All of them have a different shift schedule. And then that's the rally and response part of the diff process. And then you create a collaboration hub. Bring all those tools together, right, where it takes you into the investigation, the fix, and eventual test of it. But throughout the process, it's equally important not just to reach out to the teams that can help fix the problem, but in line with your obligations to your customers and perhaps your obligation to the stakeholders, your chief legal counsel, your CEO, you must define and decide how, when, and how often do we communicate. So as long as we have control over the drift process and we can say, hey, where do I optimize? Do I optimize detection? Where do I weak? Where am I weak today? Am I suffering from the rally and response step, right? Do I take too long to investigate? Do I have a capacity problem or a capability problem? And how quickly can I turn around, quarantine a system, download a patch, remove that 0-day vulnerability, bring the system back online, and then validate that everything is actually working? That's the drift process, but it starts with people. Always starts with people, right? And so whether you're leveraging asset management systems or configuration management databases, the reality is that we have different cross-functional teams with different HR managers. Many of your services are actually outsourced, right? So maybe the core part of your services do run from your cybersecurity response team, but come late night, it goes off to an outsourced company outside the country. So it becomes extremely challenging to engage the right kind of people. And if you're looking for a quorum from a database team, a server team, a firewall team, and the networking team, right, you need to follow different escalation processes because some teams will show up, some teams are late to show up, some teams just ignore the message, right? And as we are geographically spread, as these teams are spread geographically and they've started working from home, and a lot of them are using their personal devices because not everybody gets a corporate phone, it's equally important to understand the downstream costs. If I'm going to issue a conference call from United States of America, and that person that needs to pick up the call and join the conference bridge is sitting in Philippines, or we started from Europe and Germany somewhere, and somebody's helping them from Vietnam or Australia, right? A lot of times we've seen people actually don't participate because they're worried about the costs of it. So as we look at the concept of rally and respond, or the concept of engaging the right people, it's equally important to understand where can technology actually help you. Make sure that you have a system that people buy into, both culturally and from a financial perspective. And the other thing is we did talk about the amount of alert we receive, right? In this specific case, as you're seeing, sometimes certain customers are experiencing server slowness, but that's a result of a denial of service attack. So if you traditionally look at the systems here, probably customers are using IBM Resilient or QRadar or Splunk for the denial of service type of events. However, as it pertains to server slowness, they might be using some application monitoring tool. And the typical path is, for denial of service, it takes a cybersecurity path. For server slowness, it takes a service desk and a service management path, right? And in the new world of DevOps, it could take a completely different path because it now goes through developers. So it's very, very important that the process orchestration perhaps is more important than the tools orchestration, right? And so we need to understand that multiple events are actually related. They all need to be combined and clustered as a single problem. We may have teams that are traditional IT versus DevOps versus DevSecOps or just SecOps. They need to come together and understand what the ramifications of each of these events are. And so as part of the drift process, one of the things we've seen that works very well with our customers is how well we can bring those business processes along with the tools. And the point is very simple. A lot of us have invested in event correlation. very few of us have invested in response correlation. Is that how do we correlate the response where people get engaged and not just the tools that we're using? And then obviously, like we talked about, our tomorrow has to be better than today and yesterday. And so throughout this process, the drift process, whether it's detection, rallying, respond, investigation, fix, and testing it and building, we have to be making sure that we carry the concept of analytics, the concept of data, right? So that we can actually measure who has done what, how well did they do, and what changes are needed both to the people, the processes, or perhaps even the products that you're using to make sure that you can assess and improve your processes. It's quite possible certain teams have a capacity problem because the nature of the incident that's coming in, you're not staffed appropriately, or it's the nature of the shift system that you put in place, or how geographically dispersed you are as a team, or you might just have a capability issue. So as you're looking at, noise on the chat channel, who's running the diagnostic scripts, you'll realize that certain teams don't have that same level of capability to respond. So whether it's a capacity problem, whether it is a capability problem, whether it is a time or a issue problem, if we have analytics measuring all those three pieces, people, process, and the tools and products that you use, then we can drive clear improvements every time you complete your forensic exercises. And these are becoming increasingly important. I mean, Jay gave the example of healthcare or medical world as the emerging cybersecurity threat. One of the statistics I educated myself on was there are 13 IoT devices per patient in the United States at least, right? And that number is better, equal, or more in other developed countries around the world as well. So you can imagine that now we are talking about a direct impact to somebody's life. Just a nefarious actor monkeying with those special IoT devices that are actually keeping the patients alive. Now this is more dangerous than somebody simply saying, give me $500,000, otherwise I'm going to leak your data. So the ramifications of this pandemic forcing people to work from home and the speed with which CIOs and security people and infrastructure people are adopting technology, moving to the cloud at a much faster pace, and then obviously violating some of those core and rules of sanctity that they traditionally used to put in place are slowly dissolving. So we need to be very, very careful that we capture analytics at every stage of this process to make sure that we are driving this through. And what good looks like from our perspective is everything coming together, right? We talk a lot about event automation, we talk a lot about detection, but from our perspective, unless you can bring people together into that whole ecosystem where even your response, your approval processes, as you hand over a ticket from one team to the other, the triage team elevating it or downgrading an event, different actors and different people get involved. As long as we can make sure that the response aspect of it is also automated along with the tools and processes, then we're in great shape. I'll give you a simple example. Maybe you need to reboot an agent or quarantine a complete VLAN. And to do that, you need an approval. Wouldn't it be simple if somebody simply receives a text message saying your team is recommending that you have to quarantine the VLAN? Press 1 to approve, or press 2 to join the conference bridge and ask what they're doing, or press 3 to deny the request. This kind of a process is the response process where approvals are needed, right? And you have to now document all that is happening. So from our perspective, as we look at it, taking the same 4 challenges that we started this conversation with, I think if you can break it down into 4 simple steps, right? How good are you at assessing both the context and the severity of the event that just occurred? How quickly can you rally and respond and locate the people that can help solve the problem, but also understand, to Jay's point, you have legal obligations, right? And you have to make sure that those people, the stakeholders, are getting informed. And now, in order to make sure that you're not giving up on your customers in terms of satisfaction, you may want to locate the customers that are impacted as a result of the service being affected then communicate with them as well. So that locate step is not just the people that will fix the problem, but also the key stakeholders that need to know about it and the customers. And then especially with everybody working from home, the concept of a digital war room, a collaboration hub, and leveraging multiple technologies, right? Just look at our own organizations. Developers love to use Slack, but WebEx, MS Teams, GoToMeetings are more popular with the traditional business folks, right? So when you have multiple collaboration tools, how can you bring these people together when everybody has a favorite tool that they want to live within? And so that's why the concept of response orchestration as it pertains to these multitude of tools being used is extremely important. And then the last step, like we discussed, is to not only gather analytics for improving, but understand that there are compliance reasons for which you need to actually carry out the forensics exercise, and including, by the way, a tabletop exercise that you may want to do. So, and I do want to talk about last couple of points here. Because we are accelerating the pace with which we are adopting cloud, because we are doing businesses with third party, as Jay heard, I mean, there are obligations that extend to third parties, your supply chain, and you are going to be held liable even if it comes through a third party. Whoever you do business with, I think you should challenge the vendors. What kind of security, what kind of privacy, what kind of compliance frameworks that they're all in. Half the vendors that came out of the woodwork to help with contact tracing, remote workers, they didn't even have SOC 2 compliance. And now you have your data, your employee information all flowing through cleanly through your third-party vendor management systems, which now is increasing the threat vectors that can be leveraged against your organization. So do challenge your vendors to make sure that this looks good. And finally, if we have to say, what do we need to do end-to-end response automation? I would simply urge that we start looking at it from that same 4-step process, right? Understand what tools you use, make sure you're communicating with the right people, gain some efficiencies of scale by making sure that that one clear noise that comes through is separated from the most important signal that you actually need, and then have meaningful communication down the street, and then make sure that everything throughout the process is clearly and well captured. So sorry for going a little faster. I did want to leave a lot of time for Q&A if that comes through. With that, and I'll be happy to take any questions that are coming through the chat window. Nona, if you have any, please let us know.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. That was excellent. So let's go to any question. The first question is, what sizes of ransom are you seeing in the market following ransomware attacks, and how are attackers calculating what is an appropriate amount?
Great, sure. I'll take that one, I think. So really interesting question, and to be honest, this varies massively. But I think on average at Control Risk, we're seeing sort of an average payment of around 800,000 sort of happening. That isn't on obviously every single ransomware case that we deal with, but it's hopefully that sort of gives you some sense of what the quantum is there. In terms of how people are calculating it, this is getting a little bit more interesting now. So it used to be that purely they based it on size, and they said, if you're happy to be a Fortune 100 company, then you can pay millions, and if you're a medium-sized business, then you probably can't, but you could probably still pay 6 figures. It was a little bit. It wasn't really a science at all. Now we're seeing more scientific methods being applied, to the extent that I've seen cases where attackers actually go looking for insurance documentation on clients' networks to understand what their indemnity is with their cyber insurance, so they know the maximum that they could get. And the problem with that is, of course, once people have seen that, it's very difficult to justify why you can't pay that amount. And so that's the holy grail for them. It doesn't happen in every single case, but we've seen instances where there's a little bit more. Recently, Revil, who is a very well-known group, sort of mentioned to a security researcher that they are one of one of the attackers who is affiliated with Revil, mentioned to a researcher that they would be targeting more insurance organizations just for information on who they should target based upon the amount of coverage there are for ransom. So the industry is getting quite interesting in that regard, and I think the attackers are getting a little bit more intelligent about the way that they're targeting organizations. But I think as a general rule, I think if you're an organization with a large sort of internet presence and a brand that's recognizable, you can expect that the demand would be fairly significant to begin with. But one thing I will say is that, you know, on average, there is an ability to negotiate. There is some flexibility in those things. But, you know, the best thing, if possible, of course, is to not make those payments at all, is to try and avoid engaging in it if you can at all, sort of rebuild from scratch and start from those processes, in which case, of course, you don't need to make any payments whatsoever. But hopefully that's given some insight into how those types of organizations are targeted, but then also how these specific threat actors are trying to calculate how much is a reasonable amount, in air quotes, to ask of victims.
Thank you. I have another question here. At what point does liability for an incident get passed over to the NOCs or parties who provide the service of protection?
Yeah, and that's where I was talking about that collaboration hub and the digital war room. Now, that boundary slowly is vanishing for certain organizations, right? The concept of network operation centers, which traditionally was separate out from the concept of security operations, are merging together. There are a lot of terms out there called DevSecOps and security ops, but the idea is pretty simple and straightforward. The rally and respond piece should have structures in place where system of record can move from one system to the other. Let me give you an example. This ticket could have started in ServiceNow, right, as somebody willfully reporting it. It could have started in IBM Resilient, or it could have been IBM QRadar or HP ArcSight. The idea is, what if you have a good understanding of where the impact of this event is, whether it is coming from your configuration management database, whether it is coming from your service definitions, whether you have a deep understanding of knowing what product, what location, what service is getting impacted, you can bring that network operation center into the picture much earlier. The picture I was showing in the previous slide is that you saw a single trigger, and that single trigger reaching out to multiple audiences. Now, for stage one triage process, you can talk to that as if this is your FYI communication only, and we'll give you the next update in 35, 40 minutes, 1 hour, right? Leverage the exact same process to bring your NOC centers into the system as quickly as possible as well. And we are seeing a lot of that happening, right? And that's why I call the response part to be more important than perhaps the tools that you're using in the various departments.
Okay, thank you. And what is the greatest blocker to a good incident response chain?
I think we talked about it. We are seeing, I mean, look, Jay talked on one thing. You know, when Control Risks and Everbridge, we partner together, we offer all these cybersecurity services. You know, you saw a classic use case of where Jay was able to help a certain client. We are surprised that sometimes even the basic processes are not documented. Yeah, so I would say, what's the greatest challenge? I mean, at the basic level, you need to at least have it in a Word or a PDF or a binder sitting somewhere. So a lack of any definition of what your incident response procedures are is clearly the hardest part. But let's just say that you can go to a consultant and get that process well defined. The biggest challenge is people. Why? Because when you see a trigger comes through, you first of all need multiple teams with multiple departments, multiple shift systems. And we just discussed that there are silos that you need to jump. Application monitoring silos, network operation center silos, SRE, software reliability engineering silos, right? And so these are not even the same, they don't even roll up to the same one head, so to speak. And so it's becoming increasingly challenging, right, as we adopt digital transformation, is that it's easy to buy a tool and say, I'm transforming to the cloud. It's extremely difficult to say, carry 6 teams that will now buy into the new process or the new way of doing things. You'll have teams that will say, oh, we follow the agile methodology. Then there are teams that will say, oh, I follow the ITIL standard of doing so. Or somebody will say, oh, this consultant came to me and defined a combination of standards that we had put together. Putting that kind of process information in the fingertips of people so that they can react quickly is perhaps the greatest challenge.
Thank you. I think we got time for one more question. If a business invests in the best-in-class detection technology, will it reduce risk substantially or just partially?
Yeah, so I could
take that. Yeah.
Yeah, I could take this one. So it's a really interesting suggestion. I mean, look, there's no doubt that investing in like monitoring technologies is going to be helpful, and if used by the right people in the right way, it can be really, really powerful, and it can indeed reduce risk substantially. However, I think word to the wise is that I've seen lots of organizations spend money on the latest and greatest gadgets, but to the point that Prashant just made around kind of how you corral your people, and really that's at the essence of sort of incident response anyway, is how do you get the best out of the expertise in the room. In most companies now, there are the right expertise to deal with these issues. It's just structuring that in a way that makes sense. And I think it's one thing to have the best kind of technology stack available, but it's another thing to have people who, one, know how to use it, and two, do use it in an appropriate manner. And it's not just, you know, cyber cases where this is the case. I mean, even if you look at something that seems very different, like something like insider risk or a physical risk of some sort, there is a need to have great technology that helps you identify all the information you need and have that provided to you in a way that makes sense. But you know, that is no easy feat in and of itself. It's something that you need to spend quite a lot of time getting right. So yes, I think, you know, getting best-in-class technology can be really helpful, but in order to have, I think, significant risk reduction, it can't just be a sort of white elephant investment that sort of sits there as a black box on the network. It has to be something that is actually sort of played with and we understand in a bit more detail, and you create processes around and roles and responsibilities in terms of escalations, in terms of alerting and events. So, you know, there's a word of warning there, but yes, those technology tools can help. It is a matter though of ensuring that we're using them in an appropriate way, and we're not just engaging them, leaving them, and not having the appropriate teams to escalate and do something with the information that's generated.
Yep.
Thank you both for answering all the questions. I think we're almost at the end of our time. Prashant and Jayan, thank you so much for the very insightful content, and thank you all for joining us today. If you need any further information, you can find us on everbridge.com. Thanks everyone, and have a very good day.
Thank you very much.